Hey, what's up friends? Welcome back to my channel, and if you're new here, my name is Rose. Today I'm making a video about my son's health journey and his diagnosis with lupus and antiphospholipid syndrome. I know this is different programming than you're used to on my channel, but I just felt the need to make this video because I'm sure there are parents out there just like me who, you know, don't know the warning signs or the symptoms to look out for. And maybe some of you were surprised, just like me. If you don't know what lupus is, it's an autoimmune disease. He has systemic lupus erythematosus, which it's an autoimmune disease that actually attacks your organs. It's like your cells it's like your body is attacking itself. And he also has antiphospholipid syndrome, which is a blood disorder. And sometimes you can have either or both. He has both. I wanted to give you a little bit of background on how we found out and how this all came down. Last year, we planned a trip to Florida as a family. It was our first trip, and we were taking the kids to Universal Studios. A couple of weeks before the trip, my son was complaining that he had a headache, and he also had some neck pain. So I really didn't think anything of it because he has always had like allergies, and I thought it was just like growing pains because he was a 10-year-old boy who's growing. And a lot of times when you take them to the pediatrician and when they're complaining about pain, that's what they tell you. I didn't have any serious history in my family to think that there was anything wrong with him. And he had never shown signs of any serious illness. He was never sick. The only thing that he did suffer with was eczema. Early in his life, he had troubles with asthma. So those were the things that usually concerned me about him, and he is allergic to a lot of things. So that was the only thing that I ever worried about with him. Sometimes he complained about like joint pain and stuff like that, but I never thought that it was a problem because, you know, as I said, growing pains, that's what they tell you when you go to the pediatrician. But this was different. He was complaining about a headache for close to a week, and the headaches were getting worse and the neck pain was getting worse. So I found this very strange because usually, you know, if your kid complains about a headache, you give them medication like Tylenol or ibuprofen, and then, you know, you go to sleep and then you're fine. So that week I took him to his pediatrician a few times because I just wasn't sure. The headache wasn't going away. And so she suggested that it might be a migraine and that it takes time for migraines to go away, so he needed rest. He shouldn't be like in the light. You know, there's things like if the light bothers your eyes, your migraine could get worse. But I also took him to an allergist. They said since he was allergic to many things that, you know, that could be affecting him and maybe giving him headaches. And also they suggested that he might have like a sinus infection or something like that. They first gave him antibiotics because they wanted to rule out an infection. And then since the headaches weren't going away, his pediatrician suggested to put him on prednisone, which could help if you have a migraine. So I was told. Once he was on the prednisone, the headaches got a little better, but I still requested that he do a CAT scan of his sinuses before we go away on vacation because I didn't want to travel if this was going to be, you know, an issue for him. I wanted him to have a good time. So they did the CAT scan, and the day before we left, the doctor called me because it was kind of like an emergency thing and said everything looked fine. We were free to go on the vacation and to continue giving him the prednisone. So all throughout vacation, like that's what we did. We left and he got on a plane. We all got on a plane. He still wasn't feeling his best, but he was powering through. And the whole time that we were in Florida, he was taking the prednisone. I was giving him Tylenol. He was really tired. I remember at one point he couldn't walk, and my mom was with us, and she had one of those, like, you know, wheelchair things that you use at the parks. She suggested that he sit down because he really looked like he couldn't walk. My son, like, he really doesn't show it when he's not feeling well, so he was really trying his best. And plus, we're like in the happiest place on earth, and you know, he really wants to enjoy it because he's with all his cousins and family. So I felt really bad, but you know, the medication seemed to work for part of the day. And at night is when I noticed that he would be like super tired, but I thought it was just because we had had a long day. You know, we did the trip, we had a great time. We took the plane back home, and when we got home, I noticed that he had some bruising on the back of his legs, which was weird. And he also had, his skin had flared up, but you know, I thought that that was his eczema flaring up because he had always had issues like being in the sun. So I didn't think anything of it. He wasn't complaining about a headache as often, but the next day after we got back, he had an appointment to go to his eye doctor. We go to the eye doctor. No, well, let me backtrack. Before we went to the eye doctor, my daughters kept asking him why was he looking cross-eyed, and I didn't think anything of it. I thought that they were playing around, you know, just making fun of each other. But I was noticing that he was kind of like cross-eyed, and you know, I knew that he had an eye appointment coming up, and he had just gotten glasses like a few months back. So you know, I thought if there was anything wrong, like the eye doctor, you know, should be able to see. So that was pretty weird. He wouldn't do it all the time. He would do it kind of like if he was focusing on something. But anyways, when we got to the eye doctor took a long time to check him out and test his eyesight and stuff. And I was wondering like, oh, why is this taking so long? You know, it was just kind of like a checkup. He was asking me questions about my pediatrician and like, when did I see her? And he wanted the records on the CAT scan that they had taken, because I told him he was having a lot of headaches before we went on vacation. He didn't tell me anything at the office, so we left. And maybe an hour or two after we left, you know, we were home, and I got a call from the eye doctor's office saying that we needed to get to the ER as soon as possible. I got so scared. I didn't know what was happening, but they told me that the eye doctor had noticed that he had a lot of swelling behind his eye, and that could have been causing the headaches. So immediately, like, I pack everything up because I don't know if if it's something serious, we have to stay overnight. So I just, you know, I packed a few things, and then I got in the car and I took him to the children's hospital. And when we got there, immediately they had to run a whole bunch of tests. They had to do an MRI, they had to do a CAT scan, they had to do a spinal tap, you know, which I had to agree for them to do the spinal tap, because that's the only way they'll know if an infection was involved. He had to get labs. I mean, this was a very traumatic experience for my son. He has always been afraid of going to the doctors, but this was on another level. And I felt so bad for him because we were just coming off of this beautiful vacation, and then to have to deal with these health problems. I was in shock. All I could do was just be there for him and be supportive. So they ran all these tests, and you know, they came to me and told me that he had a blood clot in his jugular vein. I can't tell you how I felt when I heard that, but you know, I knew I had done everything that I could do before we left, and I thought everything was fine afterwards, but that was unexpected. That was something that I never thought I was gonna hear from one of my kids, or from a doctor's. I never thought I was gonna hear anything like that. So that was devastating. So they had to basically give him medication, and they had to admit him for a few days just to make sure that the blood clot wasn't, you know, breaking away or going anywhere else. They still had not figured out like what initiated the whole thing, so they had to run some more labs. So we were admitted for a week at the hospital, and doctors just kept coming in and out of the room asking questions, and we didn't have a lot of answers. All we had was, you know, it started out with a headache and a neck pain. He had not gotten hurt. There was no injury involved. There was nothing that we could say, oh, this caused that to happen. So it was very unexpected. The time that we spent at the hospital, it was just waiting for answers. We saw a neurologist, we saw a hematologist, we saw an ophthalmologist, we saw a rheumatologist. Like every doctor that you can think of came into the room. And none of them had answers as to why this had happened. But they did have some assumptions, and some of the assumptions, two of the assumptions were he had a lupus flare-up, which he'd never been diagnosed with lupus before. Nobody in my family has it. We don't have a history of it in our family, so this was news to me. I thought that was something that was hereditary, but I guess not. And they also wanted to rule out the antiphospholipid syndrome, which is like a blood disorder. So antiphospholipid syndrome can cause blood clots to form within the arteries, veins, and organs, which means he needed to be put on a blood thinner. You know, we didn't know for how long. Point is, you know, his immune system was attacking his body, and we just don't know like why this happened to him. We had no answers. But, you know, obviously when you have a situation like that, which is an emergency, doctors have to act. And so they had to put him on a medication called Diamox, which was to reduce the swelling in his brain from the pressure that he was feeling. They put him on Lovenox, which is a blood thinner. That was just for the blood clot and for the bleeding disorder. But, you know, we still didn't know like where lupus came into the picture with all this. So basically, when we left the hospital, they had written in his record that he had acute cerebral venous sinus thrombosis, which is like a blood clot. He came in with a headache, neck pain. He had pressure inside of his skull. He had the antiphospholipid antibody syndrome, which meant that he needed to be on a blood thinner. When we left the hospital, when we were at the hospital, they had to train me to give him the shots for the blood thinner, because you have to take a shot twice a day, which was not his favorite. And that was a journey in itself, aside from all the trauma that he had been through. So I quickly had to learn how to do that. We basically had to manage all this medication that he was on. I had a journal, and I would write down the times and everything that I needed to know. I had to learn really quickly what everything meant. We made an appointment for a rheumatologist to find out if he had if he had lupus. And that's when we found out, after all the labs came back, he does have lupus. He has the type that attacks your organs. And so that was really sad. I was crying at the office. I had to leave the room because he was sitting right next to me, and I didn't want him to see me crying. I never thought that I would have to deal with something like that with any of my children. They were all like very healthy babies, and I'd never had an episode, you know, a health battle or a health episode. And I know that that's naive to say that a lot of parents, you know, go through things with their children from the time that they're born. But this was a shock for us. And it was something unexpected. And sometimes I think about if this was something that could have been caught at an earlier time, but you know, the doctors assure me that there's no real way to know if you have lupus until you have an episode. And the blood clot was the first sign for him, unfortunately. So we spent months giving him the shots twice a day, him taking the Diamox for the swelling in his brain, and it slowly started, everything slowly started getting back to normal. Now he was switched to a medication called warfarin, which is like tiny little pills that he has to take. And so he doesn't have to do the shots anymore, but he does have to, when you're on blood thinners, you have to check your levels every few days. So we actually have a machine that he has to prick his finger on to do it. I'll insert a picture here. And we have to do that probably every 2 weeks just to make sure that his levels are good. Because when you're on warfarin or Coumadin, there's certain things that you can't eat. We just have to make sure that he's getting the correct dose of medication. And so right now he's on that, and he's also on medication for lupus to prevent a flare-up. And he hasn't had a flare-up for months now. We're coming up to almost a year in June, and he's doing so much better. I'm so proud of him because he's been through so much. And he always has a smile on his face, and this truly has been like a really tough experience for him and for us. At times we're still in denial that he has any of these diseases, but we have to do what's best for him and give him the medication that he needs. And we're so grateful to have insurance to do that, because I know there are a lot of parents out there that are struggling because they don't have insurance, and these medications and these treatments, they are very expensive. I'm grateful that we're able to provide him with the care that he needs. I hope that this story will help someone out there, will help you to act when your son or daughter is complaining of a pain or complaining of something that seems normal, but at the same time it's been too long, you know, and it's abnormal. I wish I would have just ran to emergency, but I trusted that the doctors were telling me what I needed to know. I didn't want to just take him to the ER because I know they run all these tests and you're not dealing with the doctors that you usually deal with. So I'm not blaming the doctors for not knowing. Sometimes in these situations, they just run their course. You kind of find out when you find out. And so, well, I'm glad that we found out when we did, because it could have been worse. And I'm so grateful that it wasn't. He is happy and stable and healthy at this point, and that's all I can ask for. I'm so glad I was able to share this story, because I was also looking for answers when all this happened. And I went on to YouTube, and you know, there weren't that many stories, you know, about kids with like lupus or antiphospholipid syndrome, but there were other stories about adults that have these diseases and how they dealt with it and how they found out. And so I got a lot of information off the internet and off of YouTube. I'm sharing my story now because maybe someone who needs it, you know, who's going through the same thing, will find my video, and I hope that this has been helpful. Thank you so much for listening to my story, and I hope you find this helpful. I'll see you next time in another video. Bye. Welcome to a new life.